Promising improved graphics and a higher frame rate, developer HAL Laboratories offers a brand new dedicated Switch 2 edition of Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Released in 2022 on the original Switch, the Forgotten Land gave Kirby its very first full 3D outing. That is, full 3D in a truly explorable 3D space, Mario 64 style, paving the way for a saccharine sweet platformer bursting with colour and ideas. All of this translates beautifully to Switch 2 today, of course. Kirby's mimic ability is a returning series staple, joined by a so-called mouthful mechanic that lets Kirby assimilate larger objects. Cars, gliders, and even staircases are all fair game, each one opening up increasingly outrageous set-piece moments. Looking back to its original Switch release, the Forgotten Land pushed the older Tegra X1 chipset with stage detail stretching far to the distance, object destruction physics, a form of baked global illumination in pockets of the environment, plus a depth of field effect that simulates tilt-shift photography. Ultimately though, on the original Switch, developer HAL also saw fit to cap the frame rate at 30 frames per second. Now that might seem like sacrilege for a modern platformer, but given the slower pace of Kirby's movement and the automatically tracking camera, 30 FPS didn't really intrude on the enjoyment here. But it's in this one aspect that Switch 2 offers its biggest perk. In doubling that to 60 FPS today, it makes this Switch 2 edition a perfect jumping on point for those that perhaps didn't get a chance to play the game 3 years back. The facts first then, this Switch 2 upgrade is a $20 or £17 extra expense if you already own the original Switch version. So sadly not a free upgrade in this case, but to justify that cost it does at least add new content, and hence a new star-crossed world expansion is added to the package. In a nutshell, the conceit is that a dark star lands offshore that threatens calamity for the planet, and so it's up to Kirby to seal it up again by playing a gauntlet of extra exclusive levels. In total, there are 12 starry stages to tackle, which are essentially remixes of existing areas that appear as an alternative to the originals on the world map. On a tech level, these are also a tougher workout for Switch 2, often evidently so. Every starry stage adds an extra layer of complexity, with these glossy, crystalline pathways spiraling around the original level. The route forward is altered, new enemies are added, and at times it's unrecognizable. This crystal material also makes extensive use of screen space reflections, SSR, mirroring just about everything in sight. It's unclear how well the original Switch might have run these stages, but in being Switch 2 exclusive, the team at HAL clearly had no issues budgeting for the Tegra T239's limits, and technically could push the boat out a little. On to the comparisons, and the first upgrade really is in image quality. While docked, Switch 2 targets 1440p at peak, the HUD overlay presents at 1440p, and plenty of gameplay hits that top number as well, but it is dynamic as with the original game and adjusts based on scene complexity. For example, the Waddle Dee Town Hub area drops to 1260p, and tellingly, the more taxing starry stages with SSR and that added geometry show the lowest value on record at 864p. Still, a range of 864p to 1440p is a big improvement on the original Switch's 810p to 1080p range while docked. Now, the second point relates to the game's anti-aliasing. The original Switch version had practically zero coverage for aliasing, leaving plenty of rough, stair-stepping in view on hard edges, made all the more glaring at points where it drops to 810p. On Switch 2, meanwhile, the game's licenses page notably adds a new listing for SMAA, Sub-Pixel Morphological Anti-Aliasing, not seen on the OG Switch version. The effectiveness of SMAA is at times limited, and there's still lots of raw, aliased edges in view on Switch 2. At the same time, parts of the frame are better treated. Combined with the higher average resolution on Switch 2, the result is a less aliasing prone picture, but do expect to still see lingering rough spots. Looking at the portable side, meanwhile, Switch 2 runs with 1080p as the maximum target, as you might expect, with drops to 900p in the regular stages, while those starry stages represent the lowest extreme with readings of 610p at points. Speaking on the broader visual comparisons, I've got to say the benefits are rather limited otherwise for Switch 2. Curiously, the install size almost triples from 5.8GB on the original Switch to 16.6GB on Switch 2, which might account for the new expansion content, but all the existing pre-rendered scenes use the same video encodes here. It's the same video as on the original Switch, with the same pattern of compression while slowed down. In actual in-engine gameplay, the differences are also quite minor. Texture assets are a match for the original Switch release, meaning pretty much every surface remains untouched in terms of quality here, quite unlike the improvements we saw in, say, the Zelda games on Switch 2. That being said, the texture filtering setting is improved slightly, causing less blur on the floor at tight angles, but it's not a radical change. Next along, object and shadow pop-in are left exactly as is as well. It's hard to miss in comparison to the original Switch, where in a matched drive forward, geometry switches between level of detail steps at the exact same points. Another missed opportunity for an upgrade. It's rather slim pickings then on the visual front, which is disappointing. On the plus side, one advantage relates to the animation quality on distant enemies. On the original Switch, animations in the far distance refresh at 50% of the overall frame rate. So if an enemy appears far away enough, they render at 15 FPS in the original Switch's case of the possible 30. On Switch 2, that 50% animation logic still applies when looking at distant enemies, but with its higher 60 FPS target, those elements now update at 30 FPS instead. Secondly, the quality of dynamic shadows is increased, and while flickering does remain as we walk forward into this forest here, the resolution is at least improved for a sharper result. The only other minor difference of note is a slight change in depth of field intensity, likely as a byproduct of the resolution change. Otherwise, each stage presents with the same level of detail, and it's the resolution bump that makes for the biggest difference. On to performance, and for context, let's look back at the original Switch version first. Generally speaking, we had an enjoyable 30 FPS experience back in 2022, though it was never exactly a perfect lock. These are nitpicks, mind you, but that 30 FPS line is punctuated by occasional single frame dips here and there, plus some larger 66 millisecond streaming hitches at rare points. Nothing game breaking, but clearly room for improvement for a succeeding console. Secondly, and more obviously perhaps, Switch 1 uses a double buffer VSync method in true Nintendo style, which means that more major drops could briefly level the frame rate at 20 FPS instead. Heavy alpha effects filling the screen is a rare trigger for this sort of behavior, but again, it's rare enough to not affect most of play. Rounding out, finally, there are some cutscenes, rare as they are, which cap at 30 FPS with uneven frame pacing on Switch. I noticed this on the very first level in fact, where the uneven cadence of frames adds lots of jarring screen judder in the process. Ideally, on the frame time graph there, we'd have a consistent pattern of one unique frame, followed by a duplicate frame over and over to create clean 30 FPS motion within a 60Hz output. So, an imperfect result on the original Switch in spots, but overall it still runs well elsewhere. From boss battles to handling those mouthful abilities, it does generally hold up well at 30, with room to improve. Swapping over to Switch 2 then, the situation is incredibly clear-cut. Despite the boost to a 1440p target, Switch 2 delivers an unwavering lock at a higher 60 FPS target. Inevitably, those pre-rendered cutscenes still run at 30 FPS as they always did, but in gameplay, everything flows beautifully at 60 with barely any room for complaint. So, to run through some of the same stress points, that taxing water alpha effect triggers no drops on Switch 2 here. Speaking more generally, there are also just 2 instances of a single frame drop in my 3 to 4 hours of play. What was once an occasional blip here and there is now an even rarer sight. And to round things off, that unevenly frame-paced cutscene on the original Switch now runs at 30 with a normal, smooth cadence of frames. The icing on the cake though really is that the Star-Crossed World expansion areas also strike a clean 60 FPS. As mentioned, Switch 2 does resort to lower numbers here on its DRS scale, down to 864p, but that does appear to mitigate any potential drops. Even Switch 2's portable play, going purely by eye, keeps the game watertight at 60 FPS, though in that case we are delving into lower resolution figures to keep that in place. Kirby and the Forgotten Land makes for a worthwhile Switch 2 edition then, even if the visual upgrades are rather limited in their ambition. Improving the geometry pop-in, or even banishing those half frame rate enemies altogether, would have removed some rough edges on Switch 2. It's really a shame that the upgrade fee doesn't stretch to these areas. Instead, developer HAL plays it safe, and what we do get is still decent. The resolution boost is obviously welcome, the doubling in frame rate is a net benefit for the game's platforming, plus a sequence of extra stages with the star-crossed world portion adds some extra value to the package for returning and new players. To be critical, it's not on par with Zelda Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom's Switch 2 editions in scope. The bar was set high there. But still, Switch 2 offers a definitive way to enjoy Kirby's latest solo outing, which is enough. That's all from me today though. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To support us at Digital Foundry, we have a Patreon of course, and to get in touch directly with myself or the team, you know where to find us. But from me for now, thanks for watching.